Under the pale light of twin moons, the jungle canopy whispered with life. A human warrior named Kale trudged through the alien world of Orithis, his body aching from the crash landing just days ago. His mission had gone terribly wrong when his exploratory vessel was shot down by a mysterious force. Stranded and low on resources, Kale had only his instincts, wits, and combat training to rely on. Yet even with all his preparation, nothing had prepared him for the deep mysteries of Orithis or the unintended consequences of a simple hand gesture. Kale had encountered nothing but hostility since his arrival. The creatures of this world were unfamiliar, some hostile, others merely curious. His first few nights were filled with terror as strange, glowing predators prowled around his makeshift shelter. He clung to his pulse rifle and limited ammunition, knowing his survival depended on staying out of sight. Yet, as the days stretched into a week, desperation forced him to wander farther into the wilderness in search of food, water, or, if luck favored him, another intelligent species willing to help. Orithis' vibrant flora and fauna were awe-inspiring. Bioluminescent plants cast a dreamlike glow across the terrain, and massive, insect-like creatures flitted between colossal tree trunks. It was a world unlike anything Kale had ever seen, both beautiful and deadly. His helmet HUD struggled to process the alien environment, providing him with only fragmented scans and scattered warnings. It was during one such trek through an emerald thicket that Kale stumbled upon the Queen. At first, he didn't realize what he was seeing. He had emerged into a clearing, his boots crunching on soft, iridescent moss. The area pulsed with life. Odd crystalline structures jutted from the earth, radiating warmth and faint musical tones. Then, from the shadows of the far tree line, she appeared. The alien queen was immense, her towering form both majestic and terrifying. Her translucent, chitinous skin shimmered like liquid glass, refracting the faint sunlight into a kaleidoscope of colors. Her head bore an elaborate crest, and her large, multifaceted eyes gleamed with an otherworldly intelligence. She moved with an elegance that belied her size, her segmented limbs weaving intricate patterns in the air as she approached. Kale's heart pounded. His first instinct was to raise his weapon, but something about her presence stopped him. She did not seem hostile, at least not immediately. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost curious. He realized she was studying him just as he was studying her. Unsure of what to do, Kale lowered his rifle slightly, hoping to avoid provoking her. The queen tilted her head, her alien gaze fixed intently on him. Her many limbs shifted in what might have been a form of communication, though Kale couldn't begin to decipher it. His translator device sputtered uselessly, overwhelmed by the complexity of her vocalizations, which sounded like a symphony of clicks, hums, and reverberations. Desperate to bridge the gap, Kale did the only thing that came to mind. He raised his left hand and performed a universal gesture of peace, open palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. It was a small, instinctive action, something he had used countless times in first contact scenarios during training. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The queen froze, her limbs halting mid-motion. Her massive eyes widened slightly, and a strange ripple passed over her translucent body, like a shifting of colors beneath her skin. Kale's stomach tightened as he realized something significant had just occurred. Before he could lower his hand, the queen mimicked the gesture, one of her slender limbs extending and splaying its many delicate digits in an almost identical motion. A low, resonant hum filled the air, and the crystalline structures around them seemed to vibrate in response. Kale's HUD lit up with warnings, but he ignored them, transfixed by the queen's reaction. Then came the bond. It was not a physical sensation but an overwhelming rush of mental and emotional clarity. Kale gasped as a flood of alien thoughts and feelings poured into his mind. He saw glimpses of the queen's life, her vast empire, her countless offspring, her intricate web of alliances and rivalries. He felt her pride, her sorrow, her boundless curiosity. At the same time, he sensed her probing his own memories, her consciousness brushing against his like a gentle tide. She saw his homeworld, his people, his struggles and fears. Kale staggered, nearly dropping his rifle. The connection was overwhelming, almost too much to bear. Yet there was no malice in it, only an overwhelming sense of discovery and wonder. He realized with growing astonishment that his simple hand gesture had signified something far deeper in her culture, an invitation to bond, to share minds and souls in a way that transcended language or biology. The queen withdrew slightly, her towering form shimmering with shifting hues. Kale felt the bond stabilize, the initial flood of sensations giving way to a more controlled, mutual understanding. Through their connection, he learned that she was not merely a ruler but a guardian of her people, a being whose every action was driven by the need to protect and nurture her hive. She, in turn, learned of his plight. She saw his crash, his struggles to survive, and his desperate hope of finding help. The queen's emotions shifted, tinged with a deep empathy that Kale hadn't expected. She reached out with one of her limbs, her touch surprisingly gentle as it brushed against his armored chest. Kale flinched but didn't pull away. The queen emitted a series of melodic clicks, and though his translator still failed to process the sounds, the bond conveyed her meaning clearly. You are one of us now. Kale didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. He had accidentally forged a connection with a powerful alien queen, one who now seemed to view him as a member of her hive. What did that mean for him? Would he be expected to stay here, to live among her people? Would they even allow him to leave? As if sensing his unease, the queen emitted a soothing hum. She gestured toward the crystalline structures, which began to resonate with a soft light. Kale felt a strange warmth spreading through him, as if the bond itself was calming his fears. For the first time since his arrival, he felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The moment of peace was shattered by a distant roar. The queen stiffened, her limbs flaring outward in a display of defensive readiness. Kale instinctively raised his rifle, scanning the jungle for threats. Through the bond, he sensed her alarm and anger. An enemy was approaching, something that threatened not only her but the entire hive. The ground trembled as the roar grew louder. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, even larger than the queen. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of jagged armor plates and writhing tendrils, its many eyes glowing with malevolent light. Kale recognized it as one of the apex predators he had glimpsed in the jungle, a creature his HUD had labeled as highly dangerous. The queen let out a piercing cry, and Kale felt her rallying call reverberate through the bond. She was summoning her hive, preparing for battle. But the predator charged before reinforcements could arrive, its massive jaws snapping inches from the queen's limbs. Kale didn't hesitate. He fired his rifle, the energy blast striking the creature's armored hide. It roared in pain but didn't retreat, its focus now divided between the queen and this strange new threat. Kale moved instinctively, his combat training taking over. He darted between the predator's attacks, his rifle blazing as he targeted its vulnerable joints. The queen fought alongside him, her limbs striking with incredible speed and precision. Together, they were a formidable team, their bond allowing them to anticipate each other's movements and coordinate their attacks. As the battle raged on, Kale realized the bond had transformed him. He was no longer just a lone warrior fighting for survival. He was part of something greater, a protector of a hive that now saw him as one of their own. The queen's determination and strength flowed through him, and he knew he would do whatever it took to defend her and her people. The predator let out a final, agonized roar as it succumbed to their combined efforts. Its massive body collapsed to the ground, shaking the earth with its weight. The queen emitted a triumphant hum, her limbs quivering with relief. Kale lowered his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the bond, the queen conveyed her gratitude and respect. Kale felt a surge of pride and belonging, emotions he hadn't experienced since before the crash. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that he might have a future on this world, not as a survivor but as a warrior bonded to an alien queen. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The jungle was vast and filled with unknown dangers, and the bond he had formed with the queen would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine. Still, Kale was ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing he would never have to face it alone. The aftermath of the battle left the clearing eerily quiet. The once vibrant hum of life had retreated into the shadows, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Kale and the queen stood over the fallen predator, its body steaming from the wounds they had inflicted. A mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration coursed through Kale's veins, but the bond's steady presence in his mind anchored him. The queen moved first, her towering form leaning over the corpse. One of her delicate limbs extended to touch the creature's hide, and a faint glow spread from the point of contact. Kale watched, intrigued, as the queen's hum deepened, resonating with the crystalline structures nearby. Through the bond, he felt a strange mix of reverence and resolve. The predator was not just an enemy to her, it was a piece of the ecosystem, a force to be respected even in death. As if on cue, the jungle began to stir. Smaller creatures emerged from the undergrowth, their forms similar to the queen's but far less imposing. Workers, Kale realized, members of her hive responding to her summons. They moved with purpose, their limbs clicking as they began dismantling the predator's body, taking only what was needed. Nothing was wasted. Kale could feel the queen's intent through the bond, her hive's survival rooted in balance with the world around them. Kale knelt to examine the predator more closely, noting its dense, armored plating. His training kicked in as he scanned the material with his suit's limited functionality. If he could salvage parts of it, he might be able to reinforce his own gear or even fashion a crude weapon. The queen's attention shifted to him, and through the bond, he sensed her curiosity. She didn't fully understand his tools or his methods, but she respected his resourcefulness. With her permission, Kale retrieved a small blade and began cutting into the creature's hide. The workers gave him a wide berth, their compound eyes observing his actions but never interfering. He worked methodically, harvesting sections of armor and tendons that could prove useful. The queen stood nearby, her presence both protective and watchful, as if ensuring his safety even among her own hive. When the task was complete, the workers retreated into the jungle, carrying the rest of the predator's remains back to their hive. The queen gestured for Kale to follow, her limbs moving in a fluid, beckoning motion. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the dense foliage at her side. The bond pulsed gently, reassuring him that he was welcome, that he belonged. Their journey through the jungle was surreal. The queen moved with an otherworldly grace, her massive form navigating the terrain effortlessly. Kale struggled to keep up, his boots catching on roots and vines, but the bond guided him, helping him anticipate obstacles. He found himself marveling at the hive's intricate network of paths, which blended seamlessly with the natural environment. It was a stark contrast to the human approach to colonization, blunt and disruptive. As they walked, Kale sensed a growing anticipation in the queen. She was leading him somewhere important, somewhere she believed he needed to see. The bond conveyed her emotions with startling clarity: pride, hope, and a deep-rooted determination to protect what lay ahead. When they finally emerged into another clearing, Kale's breath caught in his throat. Before him stood the hive. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Towering spires of organic material stretched skyward, their surfaces glistening like polished stone. The structures pulsed with bioluminescent light, their colors shifting in harmony with the queen's presence. Bridges of translucent silk connected the spires, and Kale could see workers scuttling across them, their movements precise and coordinated. The air was filled with a soft, melodic hum, a symphony of life that resonated deep within him. The queen led him toward the central spire, where an ornate archway marked the entrance. The hive's interior was even more awe-inspiring, a labyrinth of chambers and corridors bathed in soft light. The walls seemed alive, pulsing gently with the same rhythm as the bond. Kale felt a strange sense of comfort, as if the hive itself was welcoming him. As they moved deeper into the structure, Kale noticed the hive's inhabitants watching him. Their expressions were unreadable, but he could feel their curiosity and caution through the bond. They didn't view him as an enemy, but they didn't fully trust him either. It was the queen's presence that reassured them, her bond with Kale serving as an unspoken guarantee of his intentions. Finally, they reached a vast chamber at the heart of the hive. The room was dominated by a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with light, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as Kale approached. He realized with a jolt that this was the hive's core, a living, breathing entity that connected every member of the colony. The queen moved to the center of the chamber, her limbs extending toward the core. The bond flared, and Kale felt a surge of energy as the queen began to communicate with her people. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a flow of thoughts and emotions that filled the chamber like a tidal wave. She was explaining Kale's presence, his accidental gesture, and the bond they now shared. Kale stood still, feeling exposed as the hive processed the information. He could sense their skepticism, their hesitation. Yet the queen's influence was undeniable. Her trust in Kale was absolute, and she made it clear that she considered him one of them. Slowly, the emotions in the room shifted. Wariness gave way to acceptance, and acceptance to something deeper. Kale felt the bond expanding, connecting him not just to the queen but to the entire hive. It was overwhelming. The sheer volume of thoughts and emotions threatened to drown him, but the queen's presence steadied him. She guided him through the storm, helping him find his place within the hive's intricate web. For the first time, Kale truly understood the depth of their connection. It wasn't just a bond, it was a symbiosis, a merging of two very different beings into something greater. As the hive settled into a harmonious rhythm, Kale felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. The queen approached him, her multifaceted eyes locking onto his. Through the bond, she conveyed a single, profound message. You are home. Kale didn't know how long he stood there, basking in the glow of the hive's core. But he knew one thing for certain. His life had changed forever. The bond had transformed him, reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be human, to belong, to protect. And though the challenges ahead were sure to be immense, he was no longer afraid. For now, he was part of something far greater than himself, a warrior, a protector, and a brother to an alien queen. Kale spent the following days immersed in the hive's life, learning its rhythms and mysteries. The queen herself served as his guide, her bond with him acting as both a translator and a teacher. She showed him the various chambers of the hive, each with a distinct purpose. There were nurseries filled with glowing eggs tended by tireless workers, chambers dedicated to the cultivation of bioluminescent plants, and even vast caverns where resources from the jungle were processed and stored. The hive operated like a finely tuned machine, every member fulfilling a role that contributed to the greater whole. Kale marveled at their efficiency and unity. Even the smallest of tasks was performed with care and precision, a testament to the deep bond shared by the hive. It was a stark contrast to the fractured, often chaotic nature of human society, and Kale couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. Through the queen's perspective, he began to understand what it truly meant to live in harmony. The queen, however, was not content to let him merely observe. She encouraged Kale to participate, assigning him tasks that seemed tailored to his skills. At first, the workers were wary of his presence. But as they watched him labor alongside them, hauling resources, reinforcing hive walls, even helping to protect the nurseries, they began to accept him. Some even started to emulate his movements, their curiosity about his human techniques blending with their own instincts. Through trial and error, Kale discovered that the bond allowed him to communicate in ways he never thought possible. He could feel the subtle shifts in the hive's emotions, anticipate their needs, and even offer suggestions. It was a collaborative relationship, one that deepened with each passing day. But not all was peaceful. The queen's bond with Kale gave him access to her deepest concerns. Through their shared connection, he learned of a growing threat on Orithis, a rival hive that had been encroaching on their territory for years. Unlike her hive, which sought balance with the jungle, this rival was aggressive and expansionist, consuming resources without regard for the consequences. Their incursions had grown more frequent, and the queen feared it was only a matter of time before a full-scale conflict erupted. Kale listened intently as the queen conveyed these fears. She showed him visions of past skirmishes, flashes of brutal combat between her warriors and the rival hive's forces. He felt her pain, her regret for the lives lost, and her determination to protect her people. It was a burden she carried with quiet dignity, but through the bond, Kale could feel its weight. "I'll help," Kale said aloud one evening, as he stood with the queen in the hive's central chamber. His voice sounded strange in the stillness, but the bond carried his intent clearly. "Whatever it takes, I'll fight for your hive." The queen's response was immediate. A wave of gratitude washed over him, mingled with a fierce resolve. She extended one of her limbs, lightly touching his shoulder in a gesture of trust. Through the bond, she conveyed her plan, a defensive strategy that relied on the hive's strengths: coordination, adaptability, and unity. But Kale had ideas of his own. The queen watched with rapt attention as he sketched crude diagrams on the hive's walls, using a paste-like substance provided by the workers. He explained human battle tactics, drawing on his military training to propose ways they could fortify the hive and ambush the enemy. The bond allowed him to share these concepts directly, bypassing the language barrier. The queen absorbed his ideas like a sponge, her intelligence and adaptability astounding him. Over the next few days, the hive transformed. Workers reinforced the outer walls with tougher materials, creating choke points and kill zones. Traps were set along the jungle paths leading to the hive, designed to slow or disable attackers. Kale even helped the Queen's warriors craft new weapons using the salvaged materials from the predator they had slain. Spears, bladed limbs, and spiked projectiles became part of their arsenal, augmenting their natural abilities. The hive buzzed with activity as preparations reached their peak. Kale found himself in the thick of it, working alongside the warriors and workers as they readied themselves for the inevitable. The bond pulsed with a mixture of determination and anxiety, the hive united in purpose but aware of the looming danger. When the attack finally came, it was swift and brutal. The rival hive's forces descended upon them in the dead of night, their shrill cries piercing the air. Kale, stationed on one of the outer defenses, caught his first glimpse of them as they surged through the jungle. They were similar in form to the Queen's hive, but larger and more brutish, their bodies armored and their limbs bristling with jagged spines. Their eyes glowed with a feral intensity, and their movements lacked the grace and coordination Kale had come to associate with the Queen's hive. The Queen's warriors met the attackers head-on, their precision and unity giving them an edge despite being outnumbered. Kale fought alongside them, his pulse rifle cutting down enemies with deadly efficiency. The traps they had set proved invaluable, slowing the enemy advance and forcing them into vulnerable positions. The battle raged for hours, the jungle echoing with the sounds of combat. Kale's muscles burned, his every movement guided by the bond. He could feel the Queen's presence in his mind, her focus unwavering as she coordinated her forces. Her strength and resolve inspired him, pushing him to fight harder, to endure. But the enemy was relentless. Wave after wave of attackers crashed against their defenses, and Kale knew they couldn't hold out forever. The Queen sensed it too. Through the bond, she conveyed a desperate plan, a last-ditch effort to strike at the rival hive's leader and end the conflict before they were overwhelmed. Kale volunteered immediately. He didn't need words to convey his resolve. The Queen felt it through the bond. She sent a small group of her elite warriors to accompany him, their bond with her linking them to Kale as well. Together, they slipped through the chaos of the battlefield, moving with silent precision toward the rival hive. The journey was harrowing. They had to navigate enemy patrols and treacherous terrain, their every step fraught with danger. But Kale's determination never wavered. The Queen's trust in him, her unwavering belief that he could succeed, filled him with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. When they finally reached the rival hive, Kale was struck by its stark contrast to the Queen's. It was a dark, jagged fortress, its spires sharp and unwelcoming. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the ground was littered with the remains of creatures consumed in the hive's insatiable hunger. At its center stood the rival Queen, a monstrous figure twice the size of the warriors around her. Her body was a grotesque amalgamation of armored plates and spines, her eyes burning with malice. Kale felt her presence through the bond, a sharp, invasive force that tried to probe his mind. He recoiled, his connection to his own Queen acting as a shield. The battle that followed was unlike anything Kale had ever experienced. It was not just a clash of bodies but a war of minds and wills, the rival Queen's presence battering against him even as her warriors attacked. But Kale fought with everything he had, his pulse rifle blazing and his newfound allies striking with deadly precision. The bond with his Queen gave him strength, her unwavering presence a beacon in the storm. And as the rival Queen fell, her piercing cry echoing into the night, Kale knew their battle was far from over, but this victory would echo for generations. The rival Queen's death sent shockwaves rippling through her hive. The sharp, invasive presence that had gnawed at Kale's mind vanished, leaving an eerie silence. The rival warriors, once ferocious and unyielding, faltered. Their coordination crumbled, and their movements became erratic, as if a vital thread binding them had been severed. Kale's bonded warriors, sensing the shift, pressed their advantage with surgical precision, dispatching the remaining enemies or driving them into the jungle. Kale dropped to one knee, his pulse rifle still smoking in his hands. His chest heaved with the effort of combat, and his body ached from a dozen small wounds he hadn't even noticed during the chaos. The bond with his Queen flared, her emotions surging into him like a warm tide, pride, relief, and gratitude. He felt her presence, distant yet intimate, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. "You did it," he whispered, though the words were as much for himself as for her. Through the bond, she responded not with words but with a profound sense of affirmation. The hive was safe, for now. The surviving warriors gathered around Kale, their multifaceted eyes reflecting a mix of admiration and respect. They had seen him fight, seen him stand beside them not as an outsider but as one of their own. Through the bond, Kale sensed a subtle shift in how they perceived him. He was no longer just a human stranded on their world. He was a warrior, a protector of the hive, bound to their queen in a way that transcended species. The journey back to the hive was both triumphant and solemn. The rival hive's collapse was evident in the stillness of the jungle. The once constant hum of their presence had faded, leaving behind only the natural sounds of Orithis. Yet Kale knew the victory had come at a cost. Through the bond, he could feel the exhaustion of his allies, the grief for those who had fallen, and the quiet determination to rebuild. When they reached the hive, it was as if the entire colony had been waiting for them. Workers and warriors alike lined the pathways, their glowing eyes fixed on Kale and the returning warriors. A low, harmonious hum filled the air, a song of mourning and triumph, grief and hope. Kale felt a lump rise in his throat as he realized the hive was honoring him, recognizing his role in their survival. The queen awaited them in the central chamber, her towering form radiating a mix of pride and relief. Kale approached her, his steps slow and heavy with the weight of the battle. When he stood before her, she extended one of her limbs, brushing it lightly against his forehead in a gesture he now recognized as deeply symbolic. Through the bond, he felt her gratitude, her admiration, and something more profound, a sense of belonging, of unity that went beyond mere survival. Kale bowed his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I did what I had to. For you. For the hive." The queen's response came not in words but in a surge of shared emotion so powerful it nearly brought Kale to his knees. She showed him visions of the hive's future, a future made possible by his actions. He saw workers tending to thriving nurseries, warriors training under his guidance, and the jungle around them flourishing as the hive reclaimed its territory. But there was also a lingering shadow, a reminder that their victory was only the beginning. The rival hive's defeat had created a power vacuum, one that other predators and hives might seek to exploit. Kale straightened, his exhaustion giving way to a steely resolve. He had found a purpose here, a reason to fight and to live. He would not let the hive fall, not after everything they had endured together. In the days that followed, the hive entered a period of recovery and renewal. Kale worked tirelessly alongside the queen and her people, his human ingenuity blending seamlessly with their natural instincts. He helped fortify their defenses, refine their tactics, and even develop new tools using materials scavenged from the jungle. The hive's warriors grew stronger under his guidance, their movements sharper and more disciplined. But Kale's contributions went beyond combat. Through the bond, he shared stories of his own people, tales of resilience and cooperation that inspired the hive. In turn, the queen shared the history of her kind, their struggles and triumphs etched into the collective memory of the colony. It was an exchange that deepened their connection, bridging the gap between two vastly different worlds. As Kale adapted to life within the hive, he began to notice subtle changes within himself. His reflexes grew sharper, his senses more attuned to the rhythms of the jungle. He could anticipate dangers before they appeared, his bond with the queen acting as a second layer of awareness. Even his body seemed to be changing, healing faster and enduring more than it ever had before. Whether these changes were a side effect of the bond or the result of Orithis' alien environment, Kale didn't know. But he embraced them, knowing they made him a better protector. The bond with the queen continued to evolve, becoming deeper and more intricate with each passing day. It was no longer just a connection. It was a partnership, a merging of two minds working toward a shared purpose. Kale often found himself marveling at the depth of her intelligence, her ability to think not only strategically but compassionately. She was a leader in every sense of the word, and Kale was proud to stand beside her. But the peace they had fought so hard to secure was fragile. Reports from scouts revealed signs of other rival hives stirring in the jungle. The collapse of their enemy had created ripples across Orithis, drawing the attention of opportunistic predators and ambitious queens. Kale and the queen spent long hours in the central chamber, strategizing and preparing for the challenges ahead. Their bond allowed them to share ideas and insights with unparalleled clarity, forging plans that combined human ingenuity with the hive's natural strengths. Kale also took it upon himself to venture deeper into the jungle, seeking resources and allies that could aid the hive. He discovered strange, ancient ruins hidden among the foliage, evidence that This had once been home to a civilization far older and more advanced than anything he had imagined. The ruins held secrets that hinted at a greater understanding of the bond, of the connection between the hive and the world around them. Kale knew these discoveries could hold the key to securing the hive's future, but they also raised new questions about his place on This. As Kale stood atop one of the hive's spires, gazing out over the vast jungle, he felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had ever known. The Queen's presence was a constant in his mind, a reminder that he was no longer alone. Together, they had faced impossible odds and emerged stronger for it. And though the path ahead was fraught with danger, Kale knew they would face it together, human and Queen, bonded in a way that defied understanding. For the first time in years, Kale allowed himself to smile. This was his home now, and he would fight to protect it, no matter what lay ahead.